The door was heavy, solid oak, with a brass handle that felt uncomfortably warm under my palm. I didn't turn it. I just stood there in the carpeted hallway of the manufacturing hangar's executive level, listening to the hum of the ventilation system and the muffled vibration of the assembly line 3 floors below. It was 7:42 p.m. The janitorial staff wouldn't reach this wing for another hour. In the silence of the corridor, the voices from behind the wood were sharp, carrying that specific frequency of private, unfiltered certainty. "He was never meant to inherit anything," my father's voice said. It was Vance's corporate tone, the one he used for quarterly earnings and dismissing middle management. It was dry, resonant, and utterly devoid of the warmth he usually reserved for the public-facing version of our family. "This ends with you, Brooks. We've carried the weight of him long enough." I leaned my forehead against the cool wallpaper. I am an aeronautical engineer. My entire professional existence is dedicated to systems reliability. I look at stress fractures. I analyze the microscopic fatigue in titanium alloys that causes a multi-million-dollar machine to fall out of the sky. I am trained to identify the exact moment a structure fails. Standing in that hallway, I could feel the structural integrity of my own life. 29 years of holidays, shared meals, and son and brother, simply liquefying. Brooks murmured something in response, his voice too low to catch, but Vance's reply was a hammer blow. "He doesn't have the temperament. He's a technician, not a legacy. Once the transition is filed, we'll settle a flat sum and be done with the charade. It's better for the company. It's better for everyone." I didn't storm in. I didn't gasp. I didn't even feel my heart rate accelerate beyond its resting 62 beats per minute. Instead, I observed the sensation of my own detachment. It was like watching a flight recorder read out after a catastrophic event. Detached, clinical, and irreversible. I waited for them to stop talking. I waited for the sound of ice clinking in a glass, the sign that the business of the day was concluded. I checked my reflection in the polished brass of the door handle. My face looked the same, pale, sharp-featured, and remarkably unremarkable. I was the quiet one, the one who spent weekends in the lab while Brooks was being groomed for the board. I was the one they ignored because I was useful but unthreatening. I turned the handle and walked in. The office was a shrine to Vance's ego. Floor-to-ceiling glass overlooked the hangar floor, where the skeletal frames of private jets sat in pools of LED light. The air smelled of expensive leather, old paper, and the faint industrial tang of hydraulic fluid that clung to the building. Vance was behind his desk, a massive slab of walnut that looked like it belonged in a museum. Brooks was perched on the edge of a leather armchair, looking every bit the corporate strategist in a tailored suit that cost more than my first car. "Silas," Vance said, his eyebrows rising just a fraction of a millimeter. He didn't look guilty. Men like Vance don't feel guilt. They feel inconvenienced. "I thought you'd headed home." "I forgot my tablet," I said. My voice was level. It was the voice I used to explain why a turbine blade had sheared. "But then I heard you talking about the inheritance, about how I'm not part of the legacy." Brooks shifted, a flicker of something, discomfort or perhaps just boredom, crossing his face. "Silas, this isn't the time or the place. We're in the middle of a strategic reorganization." "I'm sure you are," I said. I walked toward the desk. My footsteps were silent on the deep rug. I felt a strange, cold clarity. In my world, when a component is found to be counterfeit, you don't argue with it. You remove it. You trace the source. You ensure the system is purged. I reached into my messenger bag. I pulled out a thick white envelope. It wasn't the tablet I claimed to have forgotten. Vance watched my hands with the practiced patience of a man who dealt with subordinates all day. "If this is about the bonus structure for the propulsion wing, I've already told you." "It's not about the engines, Vance," I interrupted. I used his first name for the first time in my life. It felt like biting into something metallic. I placed the envelope on the walnut desk, right between his manicured hands. It's about the DNA test. The silence that followed was heavy. It was the kind of silence that precedes a pressure vessel rupture. Brooks stood up, his posture stiffening. Vance didn't move a muscle, but his eyes narrowed. He looked at the envelope as if it were a piece of faulty machinery that had dared to stop working on his watch. "I've lived in this house for nearly 3 decades, I said, leaning over the desk. I kept my movements slow and deliberate. I've looked at the family portraits. I've looked at the way you and Brooks share that specific ridge on your brow, the way your earlobes are attached, the way you both have that slight tremor in your left hand when you're tired. I'm an analyst, Vance. I look for patterns. And for 29 years, I've been the statistical outlier in this family." "Silas, sit down," Brooks said, his voice taking on a patronizing edge. "You're being dramatic. You've always been sensitive about the hierarchy, but this is—" "The results are in the envelope, Brooks," I said, not looking at him. I kept my gaze fixed on Vance. "I took a sample from your razor 2 weeks ago, Vance, and another from the discarded coffee cup Brooks left in the lounge. The lab was very thorough. They didn't just tell me that I'm not related to you. They told me that I'm not related to either of you, not even a distant cousin. Nothing." I watched Vance's face. I wanted to see the crack in the foundation. I wanted to see the moment the lie he'd been telling himself, and the world finally suffered a fatigue failure. Vance didn't shout. He didn't deny it. He didn't even look surprised. He simply reached out, picked up the envelope, and slid it into the top drawer of his desk. He locked the drawer with a small silver key. "You were never supposed to find that out," he said quietly. His voice was no longer corporate. It was cold. It was the sound of a man who had decided a piece of equipment was no longer worth the maintenance. "It was a mercy, Silas. A business arrangement that became a family matter. We gave you a name. We gave you an education. We gave you a life." "You gave me a lie," I said. My inner monologue was a frantic calculation of variables. If I wasn't his son, whose son was I? Why was I here? Why had they kept me in the orbit of this company, working me like a rented mule in the engineering department while treating me like a ghost at the dinner table? "You have a comfortable position," Vance continued, ignoring my interruption. "You have a salary that exceeds your needs. You have stability. Most people would be grateful. But if you're going to be difficult, if you're going to let your temperament get in the way of the company's future, then we have a problem." "A problem," I repeated. I felt a surge of cold, sharp energy. It wasn't anger. Anger is hot, messy, and inefficient. This was something else. This was the feeling of a system being recalibrated. "You've spent 30 years pretending I was an heir just to use my labor while planning to discard me the moment the papers were signed. You didn't give me a life. You built a cage and called it a home." Brooks took a step toward me, his face flushing. "Watch your tone. You're talking to the CEO of this firm. You're an employee, Silas. That's all you've ever been. A useful, slightly autistic technician who happens to share a dinner table with us once a month. Don't overplay your hand." I looked at Brooks, my brother. He was a man who had never turned a wrench or calculated a load-bearing stress in his life. He was a creature of spreadsheets and golf courses. He was the future of a legacy built on a foundation of sand. "I'm not overplaying anything," I said. I straightened my coat. I felt a strange sense of freedom, the kind a pilot feels when they finally eject from a failing craft. "I'm just observing the failure. You think this ends with me being silenced or paid off? You think I'm just going to walk away with a flat sum and thank you for the memories?" Vance leaned back in his chair. He looked at me with a terrifying lack of emotion. He exhaled a long, slow breath, the sound of a steam valve closing. "You'll do exactly what you're told, Silas," Vance said, "because you have nowhere else to go. You have no history. You have no people. You are a ghost in our system, and I can delete a ghost with a single phone call. Go home. Sleep it off. We'll discuss your severance package on Monday." He turned his chair toward the window, looking out over the hangar as if I had already ceased to exist. Brooks gave me a smirk, a small, triumphant twitch of his lips, and sat back down in his leather chair. I didn't say another word. I turned and walked out of the office. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me with a finality that echoed through the empty hallway. I walked down the stairs, past the security desk, where the guard nodded to me, and out into the cool evening air. The smell of jet fuel and rain was everywhere. I stood in the parking lot, looking up at the glowing glass box of Vance's office. They thought they had concluded the matter. They thought the system had been purged of its anomaly, but they forgot one thing. I am a systems reliability engineer. I don't just find the failure, I study it, I understand its physics, and then I make sure it never happens again. I reached into my pocket and felt the small encrypted flash drive I'd pulled from the server room on my way up. They thought I was there for a tablet. They thought I was there for a confrontation. They had no idea that I had already begun to dismantle the machine. The rain in this part of the country doesn't just fall, it colonizes. It's a gray, oppressive weight that settles into the cracks of the pavement and the pores of your skin. I sat in my car in the far corner of the company parking lot, the wipers rhythmic and skeletal against the windshield. I wasn't looking at the building anymore. I was looking at the data on my laptop screen, the blue light reflecting off my glasses. My mind was doing what it always did when faced with a catastrophic structural collapse. It was looking for the black box. Vance had called my existence a mercy. In the engineering world, mercy is a word used to describe a part that hasn't failed yet despite being well past its service life. It's a soft word for a hard reality. I needed the hard reality. I needed the schematics of how I ended up in a house where I was an intruder for 3 decades. I drove 3 hours north the following morning to a town that existed primarily in the past tense. It was a place of rusted grain silos and houses with sagging porches. This was where the associate lived, Arthur Penhaligon. He was 84, a former logistics manager for the firm, and a man whose memory was reportedly a filing cabinet of every shipment, every contract, and every secret Vance had ever authorized. His house smelled of peppermint tea and old, damp paper. Arthur sat in a recliner that looked as if it had been molded around his specific skeletal structure over 20 years. He looked at me with eyes that were clouded by cataracts, but still sharp with a lingering bureaucratic suspicion. "You have your father's posture," Arthur said, his voice a dry rasp. "Stiff, like you're expecting a load-bearing wall to give way." "Vance isn't my father, Arthur," I said. I sat on a hard wooden chair opposite him. I didn't soften the blow. In my experience, the only way to get a clean reading from an old sensor is to give it a sharp jolt. I know about the arrangement. I know I was brought in after the incident. Arthur's hands, spotted with age, tightened on the arms of his chair. He didn't look away. "The incident. That's a very clinical way of putting it, Silas. But then, you always were the one for manuals and logic. Brooks was the one for the scotch and the handshakes. You were the one who wanted to know how the gears turned." "Tell me about the crash," I said. "Tell me about the engineer." Arthur sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a driveway. "It was 30 years ago, a prototype propulsion system. Vance was pushing for a government contract that would have secured the firm for a century. But the lead engineer, a man named Julian Vane, he was a purist. He said the stabilizers weren't ready. He said the software had a ghost in the code." I leaned forward. This was the language I understood. The ghost in the code is the ultimate nightmare for a systems engineer, a flaw that only appears under specific, unrepeatable conditions. "Julian went up in the chase plane to monitor the telemetry," Arthur continued, his gaze drifting to the window. "The prototype malfunctioned. Not the software, the hardware. A structural failure in the wing assembly. Both planes went down over the marshlands. No survivors. It was a tragedy that nearly bankrupted the company. And the mercy? I asked. Julian had a son, Arthur said, looking back at me. An infant. No other family. Vance was the one who suggested it. He said it was the least he could do for the man who had given everything to the firm. He adopted you. He changed the records. He turned a liability into a legacy. Or so he thought. I felt a strange, humming vibration in my chest. It wasn't grief. It was the resonance of a puzzle piece finally clicking into place. I wasn't an act of charity. I was a living insurance policy. By adopting the son of the man who gone because of their faulty equipment, Vance hadn't just saved me. He had neutralized any potential legal claim my biological family might have had against the company. He had absorbed the threat. I need the accident files, Arthur, I said. The raw telemetry, the NTSB reports. Arthur shook his head. Vance handled the recovery personally. The files were never made public. He claimed proprietary technology was involved. Everything was moved to the secondary storage facility in the valley. The analog archives. If they still exist, that's where they'd be. I left Arthur with a feeling of cold, calculated intent. I didn't go back to the office. I didn't go back to the house I had mistakenly called home. I went to a hardware store. I bought a set of high-tensile bolt cutters, a tactical flashlight, and a pair of industrial gloves. If I was going to find the truth, I had to stop being the technician and start being the investigator. The secondary storage facility was a windowless concrete block situated between a defunct airfield and a forest of pine trees. It was guarded by a single gate and a security system that was, by my estimation, at least 15 years out of date. To anyone else, it was a fortress. To an aeronautical engineer who specialized in systems reliability, it was a series of predictable vulnerabilities. I waited until 2 a.m. The moon was a sliver of white behind the clouds. I moved through the tree line, my boots crunching softly on the needles. I didn't need to cut the fence. I knew where the perimeter sensors were located. I bypassed the main gate by sliding through a gap in the drainage culvert, a maneuver that left me covered in cold, stagnant water, but invisible to the cameras. Inside, the facility was a cathedral of dust and silence. Thousands of cardboard boxes were stacked on steel shelving that reached into the darkness of the ceiling. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decomposing adhesive. I moved toward the section marked Historical Propulsion 1990-1996. It took 4 hours. 4 hours of opening boxes, scanning manifests, and checking dates. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer physical strain of moving the heavy containers. Then I found it. A black binder, thicker than the others, with the company seal embossed on the cover. It was labeled Project Icarus, Post-Event Analysis. I sat on the floor, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the gloom. I flipped through the pages, diagrams, thermal readings, metal fatigue reports. My professional instincts took over. I wasn't a son looking for his father. I was an engineer looking for a fault. And then I saw it. The date of the crash was listed as October 14th, but the maintenance logs for the prototype showed a full systems overhaul on October 16th, 2 days after the event. I frowned, flipping back and through the pages. The handwriting was different on the later logs. It was hurried, sloppy. But the patent filings at the back of the binder, the ones Vance had used to build his empire, were dated September. I looked at the schematics of the stabilizer system Julian Vane had supposedly designed. There were margin notes written in a precise, elegant hand. Structural integrity compromised at high altitudes. Recommend immediate redesign of the alloy composition. The notes were signed with a small, stylized JV. I compared the JV signature to the final patent applications Vance had filed 3 years later. The designs were identical, but the warnings were gone. Vance hadn't just adopted me to hide a legal liability. He had stolen Julian Vane's intellectual property. He had let the man go up in a plane he knew was faulty, and then he had used the man's own genius to build the company that now treated me like a disposable part. A sound echoed through the warehouse, a sharp, metallic clang. I froze. The flashlight beam stayed fixed on the binder. I didn't breathe. It came again, the sound of a heavy door being unbolted. Someone was here. I didn't panic. Panic is a failure of the processor. I stood up, tucked the binder into my jacket, and moved toward the shadows behind the row 4 shelving. I could see the sweep of a flashlight beam reflecting off the distant wall. It was moving toward my section. I stayed low, my heart steady. I knew the layout of the aisles now. I moved with the silence of a shadow, circling back toward the loading dock. I could hear footsteps, heavy, deliberate. This wasn't a security guard. This was someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. "I know you're here, Silas," a voice called out. It was Brooks. He sounded amused, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Vance figured you'd come here. You always were predictable. You think you're so smart because you can read a diagram, but you don't understand the way the world actually works." I didn't answer. I reached the edge of the loading dock and slipped behind a stack of wooden pallets. I could see him now, Brooks, wearing a designer trench coat that looked absurd in this dusty tomb. He was holding a flashlight in one hand and his phone in the other. "Come out, and we can settle this," Brooks said. "Vance is willing to increase the settlement. You can go away, start your own firm, buy a house in the mountains. Why do you care about a man who's been gone for 30 years? He was just an employee, Silas, just like you." I watched him. I saw the way he moved, entitled, careless. He didn't see the world as a series of interconnected systems. He saw it as a playground. He didn't understand that if you remove the wrong bolt, the entire structure comes down. I waited until he passed my row, his back turned to me. I didn't confront him. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a fight. I slipped out through the loading bay door, the night air hitting me like a cold shock. I reached my car and drove away without turning on the headlights until I was a mile down the road. The binder was heavy against my ribs. I had the evidence. I had the origin story. But more importantly, I had the blueprint for their destruction. Vance hadn't just stolen a life. He had built a machine out of stolen parts, and I was the only person who knew exactly where the fatigue fractures were located. He thought I was a ghost he could delete. He didn't realize that a ghost in the code is the only thing that can bring a system to its knees. As the sun began to break through the gray horizon, I pulled over to the side of the road. I opened the binder one last time and looked at my father's handwriting. The precise, elegant JV. I wasn't reclaiming my life. I was going to dismantle theirs. The architecture of a corporation is remarkably similar to the architecture of a fuselage. It is held together by tension, rivets of shared interest, and a skin of public perception that conceals a chaotic interior of hydraulics and wiring. If you want to bring down a plane, you don't need to destroy the wings. You only need to compromise the sensors that tell the pilot which way is up. I spent the next 72 hours in a motel room that smelled of industrial cleanser and desperation, mapping the sensors of the Vance Aerospace Group. My biological father's binder sat on the laminate desk like a dormant explosive. The notes were clear. Julian Vane hadn't just designed a propulsion system. He had designed a revolutionary stabilizer that reduced fuel consumption by 40% while increasing airframe longevity. Vance had patented it under his own name, but he had simplified the manufacturing process to save on costs, ignoring Julian's warnings about high-altitude fatigue. For 30 years, the company had been selling a product that was structurally compromised at its very core. I didn't go to the authorities. The authorities are a slow-moving bureaucracy, and Vance had enough lobbyists to turn a mountain into a molehill before a subpoena could even be drafted. I needed a more immediate, more surgical failure. I needed to trigger the ghost in the code that Julian had predicted. I started with the digital infrastructure. As an engineer, I had high-level clearance to the maintenance servers. I didn't delete anything. Deletion is sloppy, it triggers alarms. Instead, I introduced a microscopic lag into the diagnostic software. I adjusted the tolerances in the quality control algorithms by less than 0.5%. It was enough to pass a standard inspection, but it would cause the assembly robots to misalign the rivets on the new V9 prototype by a fraction of a millimeter. In the aerospace world, a millimeter is the difference between a smooth flight and a catastrophic structural event. I watched the internal company feeds on my laptop. I saw the messages between Brooks and the manufacturing lead. They were confused. The machines were saying everything was perfect, but the manual spot checks were starting to show inconsistencies. They were losing time. Every hour of delay cost the firm nearly $200,000 in liquidated damages. But the intellectual sabotage was only the first stage. I needed to see the impact. I needed to be the ghost they couldn't find. I returned to the hangar on a Tuesday. I didn't use my keycard. Vance would have deactivated that the moment Brooks told him about our encounter in the warehouse. Instead, I used a maintenance bypass code I'd memorized 3 years ago during a fire suppression system audit. The service entrance behind the chemical storage shed opened with a soft, pneumatic hiss. The hangar was a hive of activity. The V9 prototype, the crown jewel of Vance's upcoming government contract, sat under the high-intensity lights like a grounded predator. I could see Vance on the mezzanine level, his face a mask of controlled fury as he shouted into a satellite phone. Brooks was beside him, looking frantic, clutching a tablet as if it were a shield. I moved through the shadows of the mezzanine, my footsteps masked by the roar of the ventilation fans. I wasn't there to watch. I was there to retrieve the original physical master logs that Arthur Penhaligon had mentioned, the ones that couldn't be altered remotely. They were kept in a fireproof safe in the chief engineer's office, a glass-walled enclosure that sat directly beneath Vance's executive suite. The office was empty. I used a simple signal jammer to loop the feed on the overhead security camera. A 10-second window was all I needed. I slipped inside. The safe wasn't electronic. It was an old-fashioned dial lock. Vance liked the tactile feel of security. He didn't realize that tactile systems are susceptible to the laws of physics. I used a digital stethoscope against the cold steel, listening for the fall of the tumblers. Click, click, thud. The door swung open. Inside weren't just logs. There were the original hand-drawn blueprints Julian Vane had created. They were beautiful, precise, elegant, and filled with notes that Vance had never bothered to translate into the digital models. These were the blueprints for the perfect stabilizer. I heard a heavy footfall outside the door. I didn't freeze. I slid the blueprints into my messenger bag and ducked under the drafting table just as the door handle turned. It was the chief investigator, a man named Miller who had been with the company since the 1990s. He walked to the desk, his breathing heavy. He looked exhausted. He picked up a phone and dialed a 3-digit extension. Vance? It's Miller. We've got a problem. The stress tests on the V9 wing spars are coming back red. No, I don't know why. The software says the alignment is perfect, but the physical stress loads are failing at 60% of the rated capacity. If we roll this out for the board meeting on Thursday, the airframe will buckle during the static load demonstration. I could hear Vance's voice crackling through the receiver, though I couldn't make out the words. His tone was a jagged edge of desperation. I can't just make it work, Vance, Miller said, his voice rising. This is a structural failure. If that wing snaps during the press event, it won't just be a PR disaster. It'll be the end of the firm. We need to delay. There was a long pause. Then Miller sighed. Fine. We'll reinforce the joints with temporary braces for the demonstration. But it's a mask, Vance. It's not a fix. Miller hung up and walked out, slamming the door. I crawled out from under the table. A mask. Vance was going to fake the structural integrity of his flagship aircraft to save his reputation and secure the contract. He was doubling down on the lie that had started 30 years ago. He was willing to risk everything on a temporary brace because he couldn't afford to admit that the technician, he had discarded, was the only one who knew how to fix the flaw. I felt a cold, sharp satisfaction. This wasn't just a failure of a machine. It was a failure of character. And I was going to ensure the world saw every crack. I left the office and made my way toward the server hub in the basement. This was the most dangerous part of the plan. The hub was protected by biometric scanners, but Vance, in his arrogance, had used his own biometric data as the master override for the entire building's security. He thought his thumbprint was the ultimate key. He didn't realize that in an engineering lab, we have high-resolution scanners capable of capturing the texture of a wing's surface at a microscopic level. 2 weeks ago, I had accidentally spilled a cup of high-viscosity resin on Vance's desk during a meeting. When he had pressed his hand down to steady himself, he had left a perfect, three-dimensional mold of his thumb. I had used a 3D printer in the lab to create a silicone replica. I reached the hub. The scanner glowed a soft, expectant blue. I pressed the silicone thumb to the glass. Access granted. The server room was a forest of black towers, the air cold and humming with the sound of 1 billion calculations per second. I found the main directory for the board of directors presentation. I didn't delete the data Miller had reported. I didn't hide the failures. I did something much worse. I linked the live telemetry from the V9's stress test sensors directly to the presentation slides. When Vance stood before the board on Thursday to show them the perfect results of the static load test, the screen wouldn't show the pre-recorded faked data. It would show the real-time failing stress loads of the braced wing. It would show the red lines creeping across the diagram. It would show the structural fatigue in real time. As I finished the upload, I felt a vibration through the floor. It wasn't the ventilation. It was the sound of the hangar doors opening. I looked at the internal monitor. A fleet of black SUVs was pulling onto the hangar floor. Vance was arriving with the corporate fixers. They weren't there for a meeting. They were there to secure the site before the board arrived. I had to get out, but the service entrance was now blocked by 2 guards. I was trapped in the basement of a building that was rapidly becoming a fortress. I looked at the fire suppression controls. The system used an inert gas to displace oxygen in the event of an electrical fire. It was non-toxic, but it created a thick, white fog that obscured everything within seconds. It was a safety feature designed to save the hardware. I reached for the manual override lever. If I was going to be a ghost, I might as well have a shroud. I pulled the lever. A siren began to wail, a high, piercing scream that echoed through the concrete corridors. A second later, the ceiling vents roared to life, and a wall of white gas began to pour into the room. I pulled my goggles over my eyes and checked my watch. I had exactly 3 minutes before the emergency lockdown sealed every door in the basement. I moved through the fog, guided only by my memory of the floor plan. I could hear shouting from the floor above, security guards calling to each other, the sound of heavy boots on metal grates. I reached the freight elevator. It was a slow, lumbering beast, but it bypassed the main security checkpoints. I jammed a screwdriver into the door sensor to keep it from closing and climbed onto the roof of the cab. I began to climb the emergency ladder inside the shaft, the white gas swirling beneath me like a rising tide. When I reached the 3rd floor, I kicked open the vent and rolled out into the executive hallway. The same hallway where I had overheard Vance and Brooks 4 nights ago. It was empty. The alarm was still screaming, a beautiful, dissonant symphony of failure. I walked to the end of the hall and looked through the glass at the hangar below. Through the thinning fog, I could see Vance. He was standing near the V9, his face twisted in a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He knew. He didn't know how, and he didn't know who, but he knew the system was no longer under his control. I tapped on the glass. It was 3-inch reinforced acrylic. He couldn't hear me over the alarm, but he looked up. He saw me standing there, a silhouette against the office lights. I didn't wave. I didn't shout. I simply held up the blue binder, the one with the JV on the cover. Vance's eyes widened. He took a step toward the stairs, but the security system, my system, chose that exact moment to trigger the lockdown. The heavy steel shutters began to slide down over the mezzanine windows. The last thing I saw before the shutters closed was Vance's hand reaching out, as if he could grab the air between us. I turned and walked toward the exit. The first rivet had popped, the tension was shifting, and the board meeting was only 36 hours away. The dawn was a bruised purple, the kind of light that makes everything look like a faded photograph. I was sitting in a nondescript sedan parked 3 blocks away from Brooks's penthouse. My eyes felt like they had been rubbed with glass, but my mind was a high-frequency transmitter pulsing with the logic of the next phase. In aeronautics, when a primary system fails, the secondary systems are supposed to take the load. But if you've already compromised the primary, and you know the secondary is built on a flaw, the result isn't a backup. It's a cascading synchronization of errors. Brooks was the secondary system. He was the public face, the strategic mind who handled the investors, while Vance handled the hardware. He lived a life of polished surfaces, Italian marble, high-performance engines, and tailored fabrics. He believed in the solidity of his world because he had never had to look at the rivets. I was about to show him that his entire lifestyle was held together by a friction fit that was rapidly losing its grip. I checked my watch. 6:15 a.m. Brooks was a creature of habit, a byproduct of his need to feel in control. Every morning, he drove his custom-built, silver European sports car to an exclusive athletic club before heading to the office. The car was his pride, a machine that cost more than the annual budget of the engineering wing. It was also, like everything else in his life, a system with a specific set of vulnerabilities. I had spent the previous evening in a rented garage with a set of precision tools. I hadn't touched the brakes or the steering. I wasn't interested in a physical accident. I was interested in psychological and financial erosion. I had accessed the car's onboard computer via a wireless exploit I'd developed months ago during a boredom-induced deep dive into automotive CAN bus architecture. I hadn't disabled the car. I had simply rewritten the fuel injection mapping to create a subtle, intermittent shudder at high speeds, a phantom vibration that no mechanic would be able to find. But that was just the appetizer. The real work was in the trunk. As Brooks emerged from his building, looking refreshed in a designer tracksuit, I felt a clinical sense of observation. He climbed into the silver car, the engine barking to life with a throatiness that echoed off the glass towers. He pulled out of the garage, the tires chirping on the concrete. I followed him at a distance, staying 2 cars back. When he reached the club's private parking structure, I waited. The facility was nearly empty at this hour. He parked in his reserved spot, right under a high-definition security camera that I had already redirected to a loop of an empty space. He headed inside, his mind likely focused on his reps and his protein shake. I moved quickly. I didn't need a key. I used a signal relay to trick the car into thinking I was the fob in Brooks's pocket. The doors unlocked with a soft, electronic chirp. I didn't go for the glove box or the center console. I went for the trunk. Inside was his briefcase, the one he took to every high-level meeting. It contained his laptop, his encrypted drives, and the physical tokens for the family's offshore trust accounts. I didn't steal them. Theft is a simple crime with a simple solution. I opened the laptop and inserted a specialized hardware key. Within 90 seconds, I had cloned the drive, and more importantly, I had installed a transparent proxy. Every trade he made, every transfer he authorized, and every message he sent would now pass through my server first. I looked at the trust account tokens. These were the keys to the Vance family's private kingdom, the wealth they had skimmed from Julian Vane's stolen patents over 3 decades. I didn't drain the accounts. Not yet. I simply adjusted the permissions. I added a 3rd signatory to the accounts, a shell company registered in the name of a non-profit foundation dedicated to aviation safety. I closed the trunk and relocked the car. As I walked away, I felt the first real spark of a new sensation. It wasn't joy. It was the feeling of a calculation being proved correct. I waited for him in the shadows near the elevator bank. When he returned 45 minutes later, smelling of expensive soap and sweat, he nearly walked right into me. He stopped, his face transitioning from confusion to an ugly, pinched sneer. "Silas," he said, his voice echoing in the concrete space. "You've got some nerve showing up here after the stunt you pulled at the hangar. Vance is beyond furious. There are teams looking for you." "I know," I said. I leaned against a concrete pillar, my hands in my pockets. "But they're looking for a technician. They aren't looking for the person who owns your bank accounts, Brooks." Brooks laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You're delusional. You think you can just hack into our lives? We have the best security money can buy. You're a glorified mechanic who got lucky with a door code." "Is that what you think?" I asked. I pulled out my phone and pressed a single button. Across the garage, Brooks's car suddenly blared its horn. The lights flashed in a frantic, irregular pattern. Then the windows rolled down and back up, over and over. It was a digital seizure, a public display of total loss of control. Brooks stared at the car, his face going pale. "What are you doing?" "Stop it." "I'm showing you the fatigue points, Brooks," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "Your car, your penthouse, your strategic career, it's all built on a legacy you didn't earn. And right now, the stress loads are exceeding the design limits. I've seen the trust accounts. I've seen the transfers Vance has been making behind your back." That stopped him. The sneer vanished, replaced by a flicker of genuine doubt. It was the logical twist I had discovered in the data I'd pulled from the office safe. Vance wasn't just planning to discard me. He was planning to consolidate everything into a single-owner trust that bypassed Brooks entirely. Vance didn't trust Brooks with the company any more than he trusted me. He saw Brooks as a useful mouthpiece, but he intended to remain the sole pilot until the very end. "You're lying," Brooks said, but his voice lacked conviction. He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. "Check the Project Legacy folder on your drive," I said, "the one encrypted with your mother's maiden name. Vance set it up 6 months ago. It's a restructuring plan. On the day the V9 contract is signed, your position is moved to a non-voting advisory role. You get a salary, but you lose the keys to the kingdom. He's replacing you with a corporate fixer from the London office." Brooks's hand was trembling. I watched the movement, the same slight tremor I had noticed in Vance. It was the only thing they truly shared, a genetic predisposition for instability under pressure. "He wouldn't do that," Brooks muttered. "I'm his son." "You're a component, Brooks, and components are replaceable when a more efficient model comes along. He didn't even tell you about the stabilizer flaws, did he? He let you stand in front of the board and lie about the safety ratings while he knew the wing spars were failing. He was going to let you take the fall if the prototype buckled." Brooks looked at his car, which had finally gone silent. The silence was worse than the noise. It felt heavy, like the air in a cabin before it loses pressure. He looked back at me, and for a second, I saw the boy I had grown up with, the one who used to hide behind me when Vance lost his temper. Then the mask of the corporate strategist slid back into place, but it was cracked. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "You hate me." "I don't hate you, Brooks. I don't feel enough for you to hate you. I'm just an engineer. I'm showing you the structural failure of your own life so you can decide which way to jump before the collapse. Because when I trigger the board meeting takeover tomorrow, Vance is going to look for someone to blame, and you're the most convenient target." I stepped closer to him. He didn't move. He smelled of fear now, a sharp, metallic scent that cut through his cologne. "Give me the master key for the hangar's internal surveillance," I said. "The physical one you keep on your keychain. The override for the black site servers." Brooks looked down at his keys. He looked at me. He was calculating his odds, trying to find a path that kept him in the air, but he was a strategist, and he knew a losing hand when he saw one. He unclipped a small, matte black USB fob and held it out. His fingers brushed mine, cold and damp. "What are you going to do?" he whispered. "I'm going to finish the work Julian Vane started," I said. "I'm going to make sure the truth is the only thing left standing." I took the key and walked toward the exit. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear Brooks's car alarm start up again, a lonely, mechanical wail in the empty garage. I spent the rest of the day in a high-speed data center, using the master key to bypass the final layers of Vance's encryption. It was all there. The original crash reports, the altered telemetry, the memos discussing the disposal of the engineer's remains. There were even recordings of Vance talking to the corporate fixers, discussing how to manage me if I ever started asking questions. But the most devastating find wasn't about the past. It was about the present. Vance had been shorting his own company's stock through a series of shell corporations. He knew the V9 was a failure. He knew the contract was a house of cards. He was planning to let the firm collapse after the board meeting, walk away with the insurance and the short sale profits, and leave Brooks and the 3,000 employees of Vance Aerospace with nothing but a pile of lawsuits and a ruined reputation. He wasn't reclaiming his life. He was burning the world down for a profit. I sat back, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in my eyes. The board meeting was in 18 hours. The stage was set. The rivets were gone. The tension was at its maximum. All that was left was the final load test. I felt a strange, quiet calm. I wasn't the outlier anymore. I was the center of the system. I was the one who decided when the structure finally gave way. I reached for my phone and sent a single text to the personal number of the chairman of the board. Subject: the V9 telemetry. See the attached file. Don't look at the slides tomorrow. Look at the reality. I closed my laptop and stood up. I didn't need sleep. I had the clarity of a machine. Tomorrow, the Vance legacy would meet its terminal velocity. The boardroom of Vance Aerospace sat on the 60th floor, a glass-encased plateau that looked down on the city like an observation deck for gods. The table was a 20-foot expanse of polished obsidian, reflecting the grim, expectant faces of the 12 men and women who held the company's debt in their hands. The air was pressurized, silent, and heavy with the scent of ozone and expensive coffee. At the head of the table, Vance stood with his hands gripped on the back of his chair, his knuckles white. He looked like a man trying to hold a mountain together with his bare hands. Brooks sat to his right, staring at a blank legal pad, his skin a shade of gray that matched his silk tie. I wasn't in the room. Not physically. I was in the technician's booth, a small, darkened chamber behind a one-way mirror. The AV tech had been dismissed 10 minutes ago after I presented him with a forged security audit authorization and a firm suggestion that he take an early lunch. Now I sat at the master console, my fingers hovering over the glass interface. I was the ghost in the machine, and the machine was finally ready to speak. "The V9 is more than a prototype," Vance began, his voice projecting a confidence that I knew was a hollow shell. "It is the culmination of 30 years of engineering excellence. The static load tests we are about to review confirm that our proprietary alloy stabilizer system is the most reliable in the history of civil aviation." Vance nodded to Brooks, who reached for the remote to initiate the presentation. On the massive 8K screen behind them, a title slide appeared. Project Icarus, Strength Through Stability. "Show them the live telemetry from the hangar, Brooks," Vance commanded. "Let them see the structural resilience in real time." Brooks pressed the button. I watched through the glass as the screen flickered. In a standard operation, it would have displayed a pre-recorded looped video of a successful stress test, showing green bars and ascending graphs. But I had redirected the feed. The screen split into 4 quadrants. Instead of the polished PR footage, It showed the raw, unedited camera feeds from the hangar floor. In the center was the V9 airframe, surrounded by massive hydraulic rams. The board members leaned forward, murmuring. This wasn't the slick presentation they expected. This was the grit of the workshop. "What is this?" the chairman, a woman named Holloway with eyes like flint, asked. "Vance, this isn't the data you sent us in the briefing." "A minor technical glitch," Vance said, his voice tightening. "Brooks, fix the feed." Brooks mashed the button, but I had locked him out. I initiated the second phase. On the screen, a new window opened. It was a side-by-side comparison. On the left were the original hand-drawn blueprints I had recovered, Julian Vane's work. On the right was Vance's optimized design. Red lines began to crawl across the digital model, highlighting every point where Vance had thinned the metal or removed a support brace to save on manufacturing costs. "As you can see," I spoke into the room's intercom, my voice amplified and modulated so it sounded like a dispassionate AI, "the structural integrity of the V9 is currently operating at a 40% deficit compared to the original design specifications. The hydraulic rams in the hangar are presently exerting only 60% of the rated flight load. Watch the wing spar." On the live feed, the V9's left wing began to vibrate. A low, groaning sound, the scream of metal reaching its limit, filled the boardroom. "Shut it down!" Vance roared, turning toward the booth. He couldn't see me through the mirror, but he knew. "Security, get in here!" I didn't stop. I opened the financial files. The screen transformed into a waterfall of transaction logs. "While the engineering department was being forced to compromise safety," I continued, "the executive office was busy liquidating the firm's assets. Over the last 18 months, $64 million have been moved through shell companies, all of which lead back to a single private account held by Vance." The room erupted. Holloway stood up, her face a mask of fury. "Vance, explain this. Now!" Vance didn't look at her. He was staring at the mirror. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. He looked like a man who had finally realized that the structural failure wasn't in the plane, but in the ground beneath his feet. "It's a fabrication," Brooks stammered, his voice cracking. "It's Silas. He's disgruntled. He's hacking the system." "I'm not hacking, Brooks," I said, switching off the voice modulator. I stepped out of the booth and walked into the boardroom. The heavy doors clicked locked behind me. I was wearing my grease-stained work jacket over a clean white shirt. I looked exactly like what I was, the man who knew how things worked. "I'm performing an audit." I walked to the head of the table. I didn't look at the board. I looked at Vance. I pulled a single, notarized document from my pocket and laid it on the obsidian table. It was the ownership transfer I had finalized using the master tokens Brooks had given me, the ones that activated a dormant clause in the company's founding charter regarding the rights of the lead engineer's legal heirs. "The patents that built this company were stolen from Julian Vane," I said, my voice calm and steady. "As his sole surviving heir, and under the terms of the fraud restitution clause in the 1994 charter, I have initiated a total seizure of the intellectual property. As of 9 minutes ago, Vance Aerospace Group no longer owns the rights to the engines, the stabilizers, or the V9 airframe. I do." I turned to the board. "The company is currently insolvent. You are sitting in a building that is owned by a man who is about to be under federal investigation for securities fraud. However, I am willing to negotiate a restructuring, provided the current leadership is removed immediately." Holloway looked at the document, then at Vance. "Vance, leave, now, before I call the police to escort you out." "You can't do this," Vance whispered. He looked at the screen, where the V9 wing spar finally buckled with a sound like a gunshot. The prototype slumped in its cradle, a shattered wreck of titanium and lies. "I built this, I made you." "You didn't build anything," I said. "You just managed the theft, and now the bill is due." Security arrived, but they weren't there for me. I had already updated their clearance. They walked to Vance and Brooks. "Please come with us, sir," the lead guard said. His tone was professional, but there was a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. Every employee in the building had seen the feed. They all knew now. I watched them being led out. Brooks was silent, his head bowed, his tailored suit looking like a costume that no longer fit. Vance stopped at the door. He turned back, his eyes searching mine for some sign of the son he had pretended I was. "Silas," he said. "My name is Vane," I replied. The doors closed. I was alone in the room with the board of directors. The silence was absolute. I walked to the head of the table and sat in the chair Vance had just vacated. I felt the cool, hard surface of the table under my palms. "Now," I said, looking at Holloway, "let's talk about the recovery plan. We have a lot of work to do if we're going to make this company structurally sound." But the public exposure was only the first part of the descent. I spent the next 3 hours watching the internal monitors as Vance and Brooks were escorted to the curb. Their personal items had already been packed into cardboard boxes, the same kind of boxes I had searched in the warehouse. I stood at the window, watching them stand on the sidewalk. They looked like tourists who had lost their map. No car came for them. I had canceled the executive car service. No private security followed. I had revoked their contracts. They were just two men in expensive clothes, standing in the rain, surrounded by the ruins of a legacy that had never been theirs. I picked up the phone on the desk. It was a direct line to the estate's head of household. "This is Silas Vane," I said. "Change the locks on the main house. The gate codes are to be reset. If Vance or Brooks attempts to enter the property, they are to be treated as trespassers. Their personal effects will be delivered to a storage unit in the valley tomorrow." I hung up. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I felt the quiet, steady satisfaction of a machine that had been recalibrated to its correct frequency. I returned to the screen and began the process of deconstructing the shell companies. I watched the numbers crawl back into the main corporate accounts. Millions of dollars, shifting across the digital landscape, returning to the system they had been stolen from. I saw the Project Legacy folder Brooks had mentioned. I opened it. It was worse than I thought. Vance hadn't just been planning to sideline Brooks. He had been planning to frame him for the short sale scheme. He had planted digital footprints that led directly to Brooks's personal laptop. He had been ready to throw his only biological son to the wolves to save his own skin. I felt a momentary flicker of something like pity for Brooks, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of the smirk he'd given me in the office. They were both part of the same faulty system, and a system cannot be fixed by keeping the parts that caused the failure. The sun was beginning to set, casting long orange shadows across the boardroom. I looked at the broken prototype on the monitor. It was a wreck, but the data was pure. For the first time in 30 years, the company was grounded in reality. I had one final task. I opened the communication channel to the entire company, all 3,000 employees, from the senior engineers to the janitorial staff. I didn't send a memo. I sent a single image. The original blueprint of the Julian Vane stabilizer, restored to its full, uncompromised glory. Underneath, I wrote 3 words: "Stability is restored." I stayed in the office until the building was dark. I watched the city lights flicker on, a grid of perfect, predictable logic. I was the owner of a global aerospace firm. I was a multimillionaire. I was the architect of my own identity. But as I looked at the chair across from me, the one Brooks had occupied, I knew the confrontation wasn't over. Vance wouldn't go quietly into the night. He was a predator, and even a wounded predator has teeth. He was at the estate now, likely trying to talk his way past the guards or find some hidden reserve of cash he'd tucked away. I stood up and grabbed my jacket. It was time for the final load test. It was time to meet him on the ground he thought he owned. The drive to the estate was a study in terminal velocity. The road wound through the hills, a black ribbon of asphalt flanked by ancient, skeletal trees that seemed to lean in as the car swept past. I drove the company SUV, a heavy, armored vehicle that felt like a mobile bunker. I didn't rush. In a controlled descent, speed is less important than trajectory. I knew exactly where Vance would be. He wouldn't be in the library or the master suite. He would be in the war room, the basement office where he kept the physical trophies of his acquisitions and the hard copies of the records he didn't trust to the cloud. The iron gates of the estate stood open. The security team I had hired, men with no loyalty to the Vance name, had already cleared the perimeter. The house itself sat on the ridge like a grounded monolith, every window dark except for a single glow coming from the lower level. I pulled up to the front circle, the gravel crunching under the tires with a sound like grinding teeth. I stepped out into the night air. It was silent, save for the distant hum of the city and the wind whistling through the eaves. I walked to the front door, the heavy oak slab that had once felt like a barrier. Now, I pressed my thumb to the scanner. The light turned green. The lock disengaged with a solid mechanical thud. I walked through the foyer. The house felt different, hollowed out. The portraits on the walls, the expensive vases, the marble floors, they were no longer the artifacts of a family. They were just assets in a liquidation manifest. I followed the light down the stairs to the basement level. The door to the war room was ajar. I pushed it open. Vance was there. He had broken into his own safe, not with a code, but with a pry bar. He was surrounded by piles of paper, his hair disheveled, his expensive shirt stained with sweat and grease. He looked up as I entered, and for a second, the predatory light in his eyes flickered. He held a heavy bronze award, a Manufacturer of the Year trophy, as if he intended to use it as a weapon. "You're trespassing, Vance," I said. My voice was the only steady thing in the room. "Trespassing?" He let out a ragged, breathless laugh. "I built this house. I bought this land. I put every brick in place while you were playing with plastic planes in your bedroom." "You bought it with a stolen name," I said. I walked to the center of the room, stopping just out of his reach. I didn't feel the need to shout. The physics of the situation were already settled. The court order for the property seizure was signed an hour ago. The locks you broke were the only things keeping you from being a common thief. Vance dropped the trophy onto the rug. It made a dull, heavy sound. "You think you've won because you have a piece of paper? I have 30 years of leverage. I have contacts you can't even imagine. I'll tie you up in litigation until your hair turns gray. I'll ruin the firm before I let you run it." "The firm is already being rebuilt," I said. "Holloway and the board have accepted the restructuring. The V9 is being scrapped. We're going back to Julian's original designs, the ones that actually work." Vance stepped toward me, his face twisting into a mask of pure, concentrated resentment. Julian was a dreamer. He didn't have the stomach for what it takes to dominate an industry. He was a component, Silas, a high-quality component, but a component nonetheless. I was the one who made him relevant. "You were the one who let him fail," I corrected him. "You saw the flaw in the wing spar, and you let him go up anyway because you needed the insurance money to cover your gambling debts. You didn't make him relevant. You made him a martyr for your ego." I reached into my bag and pulled out the final document, the one I had spent the afternoon preparing with the forensic accountants. It wasn't an ownership transfer. It was a total divestment. "This is the final load test, Vance," I said, laying the paper on the desk. "I've traced every cent of the shell company money. It wasn't just short selling. It was embezzlement from the employee pension fund, $600 million, and I have the logs that show you tried to frame Brooks for it." At the mention of his son, Vance's expression shifted. "Brooks is a fool. He wouldn't know a ledger from a lunch menu. He's a fool who is currently giving a full statement to the federal investigators," I said. "I met him at the club this evening. I showed him the files. I showed him how you were going to let him take the fall for the pension collapse while you fled to a non-extradition territory. He was quite eager to cooperate once he realized his father had already replaced him. Vance slumped against the desk, his strength finally failing. The structure had reached its breaking point. I could almost hear the microscopic cracks spreading through his composure. He looked at the paper, then at the room full of trophies that were now just evidence. "What do you want?" he whispered. "I don't want anything from you," I said. "I already have the name. I have the company. I have the truth. I'm just here to watch the collapse." I walked over to the wall of shelves behind his desk. It was filled with models of every aircraft the company had produced under his tenure. I picked up the model of the prototype Julian had been lost in. It was a beautiful thing, sleek, silver, and perfectly balanced. "This was the last thing he ever worked on," I said. I looked at the model, then at Vance. "He warned you. He gave you the chance to be an honest man, and you chose the shortcut." I let the model go. It fell to the hardwood floor, the delicate wings snapping off on impact. The sound was sharp, final. Vance let out a low, guttural sound and lunged at me. He was old, and he was tired, but he had the desperation of a man who had lost his gravity. He grabbed the front of my jacket, his fingers trembling. "I'll break you," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "I'll find a way to take it all back." I didn't move. I didn't recoil. I looked into his eyes with the clinical detachment of a man inspecting a failed turbine. "There's nothing left to break, Vance. You've exceeded your load limit. You're just a vibration in an empty hangar now." I gripped his wrists, not with violence, but with the steady, overwhelming pressure of a hydraulic press. I peeled his hands off my jacket. He was surprisingly light, as if he were made of balsa wood and old paper. I pushed him back into the leather chair, the chair that had once been his throne. I stood over him, my shadow stretching across the room. "The police will be here in 10 minutes. I've provided them with the codes to the war room safe. Everything you thought you hidden, the offshore routing numbers, the original accident photos, the correspondence with the fixers, it's all been indexed." Vance stared at the floor. He didn't look like a CEO anymore. He looked like a tired old man sitting in a basement full of trash. "Why?" he asked. "You could have had it all. We could have been a family. You could have been the greatest engineer in the world under my wing." "I am the greatest engineer in the world," I said, "because I know that a system built on a lie is a system that eventually falls, and I've always preferred the truth. It's more reliable." I turned and walked toward the stairs. I didn't look back at the room or the man in it. I had performed the analysis. I had identified the fault. I had executed the repair. As I reached the foyer, I saw Brooks standing by the front door. He looked battered, his expensive coat rumpled, his eyes red. He looked at me with a mixture of fear and a strange, newfound respect. "Is he down there?" Brooks asked. "He's exactly where he belongs," I said. I walked past him, heading for the front door. "What happens to me?" Brooks called out. I stopped at the threshold. I looked out at the night sky, where the lights of a distant plane were moving steadily across the horizon. A stable, predictable flight path. "You find a job, Brooks. Somewhere they don't know your last name. Somewhere you have to earn your own rivets. If you're lucky, you might even learn how to build something." I walked out into the cool night air. The sirens were audible now, a rising chorus of blue and red light reflecting off the trees at the end of the long driveway. I walked to my car and got in. I didn't wait for the arrest. I didn't need to see the handcuffs or the headlines. The work was done. I started the engine. The dashboard lit up, a perfect, glowing array of sensors and systems, all reporting green. I put the car in gear and began the drive back to the city. The legacy was gone. The weight was lifted. I was Silas Vane, and for the first time in 29 years, my altitude was true. I reached the gate and looked into the rearview mirror. The house on the hill was getting smaller, the single light in the basement finally flickering out as the security team shut down the power. I pressed the accelerator. The engine hummed with a pure, uncompromised frequency. I didn't think about the past. I didn't think about the man in the basement. I only thought about the sky and the infinite, logical beauty of a machine that finally functioned exactly as it was designed. The road ahead was open, clear, and perfectly aligned.